Hello, and welcome to or back to my channel. I'm Kit, your friendly feminist cat lady spinster, and today we're going to talk about biblical gender roles guides to grooming and disciplining your young wife. Before we get into the video, just some quick housekeeping. I have timestamps in the description box below if you would like to just get straight to the video. If you like this video, please like and leave a comment. If you dislike this video, please dislike and leave a comment. Any engagement is good engagement to the algorithm. Okay. If you enjoy my channel, please subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, I'm so glad you're here. My social media is linked below. I'm Candidly Kit on Twitter and Instagram. I also have a Patreon now. If you really like my content, please think about becoming a patron. I would greatly appreciate it. And if you want to do none of the above, that's totally fine. And now, let's get back to the video. If you're unfamiliar with biblical gender roles, well, yes, it is as horrifying as it sounds. A man going by the name Larry Solomon, and I can totally see why he uses a pseudonym, has a website where he discusses gender roles. He also has a website about biblical politics and biblical sexology. I did a video last summer about his 10 sex rules for wives. Well, allegedly a woman sent them in and they were given to her by her husband on their wedding night, but I have doubts about the veracity of that story. Anyway, I'll link to that video above. So these two guides have been on my radar for a while, which I'm sure you can probably guess why, judging from the titles. And first we're going to talk about how a Christian husband guides his young wife because, well, it's not fair to discipline her if you haven't groomed her yet. A Christian husband's guide to grooming his young wife. He goes through a long spiel about how talking about grooming triggers humanists, but he assures us that grooming can also apply to humans because the word grooming can appear in such sentences as a well-groomed woman. He then gives us 3 requirements before you can begin your grooming. You and your bride must both be believers, you both need to be biblicist Christians, and your wife needs to be young. I have consistently heard from mentoring couples I have spoken with that the grooming of a bride has the most success in women under the age of 25. After that, the chances of success radically fall, even with believing wives. Which makes sense because the older you get, the less likely you are to put up with such nonsense. This is also why certain groups think women should marry as soon as possible. And now let's look at the steps. Step number 1. Unlearn what your culture has taught you. God calls us to unlearn the false teachings of this world that we have been conditioned with our entire lives. This will require a radical worldview change for both you and your wife. One of the hardest changes to make for many couples is the rejection of the adult-child paradigm. Our modern culture teaches us that there are only 2 primary social classes, adults and children. Children have limited rights until they reach adulthood and then they have full autonomy. The Bible does not recognize the adult-child paradigm, but rather it specifies 3 primary classes of people within society, and those are men, women, and children. Under God's law, the social class of men are the only ones who have full autonomy. Women are to be under the authority of men in the home, the church, and society at large, and children are to honor and obey their fathers and mothers. It is impossible to fully embrace the teachings of the Bible concerning gender roles without a husband and wife first being willing to fully reject the modern teaching of the adult-child paradigm. When a Christian wife comes to reject the adult-child paradigm, the whole "you are not my father" and "you are treating me like a child" will quickly disappear. So only men get to be autonomous humans. Okay. Step number 2. You must learn and embrace biblical gender roles. But if you have to learn them, that means they're not innate. Okay. An understanding and full acceptance of the doctrines of the Bible concerning gender roles is a critical first step for you as a husband to begin the grooming process with your wife. See, I would just think that you would talk about it and come to the conclusion together that you want to follow biblical gender roles, but I can see where a woman would have resistance and you would have to convince her that it is her biblical duty as a good wife, good Christian to follow these rules. Step number 3. Seek out a male spiritual mentor. Finding a wise and godly man to mentor you will be crucial to helping you as you seek to groom your young bride. Step number 4. You must teach your wife biblical gender roles. God calls you to be your wife's primary spiritual teacher. Once you have fully absorbed and embraced the teachings of the Bible concerning gender roles, you must then teach each of these doctrines to your wife. I would suggest you use the order I give on my biblical gender roles page, as each doctrine builds on the previous one given. You should also seek advice from your mentor as to how to approach each of these important doctrines with your wife. Step number 5. Get your wife a female spiritual mentor. The Bible does not just support the concept of female mentorship, but it actually commands it. You may hear some horror stories from older men whose wives were actually led astray by ungodly advice from their girlfriends at church or elsewhere. But mentoring by good and godly women who fully embrace and live out biblical gender roles can have life-changing effects on women. Step number 6. Mold your wife into the glorious wife you want her to be. Christ did not give up his life for his wife's happiness. He gave up his life to purchase his wife so that he could groom her into the wife he wanted her to be. And this is what God has called you as a Christian husband to do. These scriptures teach that God created your wife for you to bring you glory, and when your wife brings you glory, this brings God glory. So, you as a man bring glory to God by your submission and service to him, and your wife brings glory to God by her submission and service to you. What this means, practically speaking, is that you need to begin to mold your wife to your preferences for her behavior. You should never feel guilty in desiring your wife's submission and service to you, but rather you should enjoy this as God enjoys our submission and service to him. So what are some practical ways that you can groom your wife into the glorious wife you want her to be? You can make her modify her clothing style to the styles you prefer. You can make her learn to cook the foods you enjoy. You can make her watch the TV shows you like to watch. While husbands are commanded not to deny sexual relations to their wives, the Bible never commands wives to make their husbands satisfy them sexually. It does, however, command men to do just that in the passage above. A Christian wife's grooming, her God-ordained subjection to her husband, is never complete until she has been groomed to be loving, pleasant, and completely sexually satisfying to her husband. So basically he gets like a real live doll to modify to his liking. I'm not really seeing how Christian this is, but okay. Step number 7. Discipline your wife. Christ associates his rebuke and chastening with his love for his churches. So if a husband is loving his wife as Christ loves his church, then he will rebuke and discipline his wife. Otherwise, he is not loving her as Christ loves his church. Discipline from you towards your wife is crucial for the grooming process to work in the life of your wife. So see, you discipline her because you love her and you fear for her salvation. There are many ways to discipline your wife. I used to be against wife spanking, then I was neutral to it as I could see no condemnation of it in the Bible, and now over the last couple of years I come to see it as the most effective tool a husband can use in his role as a human instrument of sanctification in the life of his wife. And this is not a newly invented disciplinary tool of husbands, but rather wife spanking was fairly common throughout history before the last 50 years or so. Whenever I speak on wife spanking, I must issue the following cautionary note. While it is a husband's God-given right to use spanking as a form of discipline on his wife, with or without her consent, a husband should be wise in regard to the hostile culture we live in. We live in a culture which denies almost all the rights that God has given to a husband, including his right to discipline his wife. That means that if you do not have your wife's consent to spank her and she calls the police on you, you may go to prison for domestic abuse. One of the most important things I have learned from these wife spanking mentoring couples is that it is very difficult and rare to get a wife to accept wife spanking if she is past her mid-20s and especially into her 30s. So, it is important to reach women with these mentoring programs while they are still young and moldable. Conclusion. As I close this guide, I want to leave husbands with a very important consideration. Any husband reading this needs to accept the possibility that his grooming attempts will be met with complete rejection by his wife, even if she claims to be a biblicist Christian and even if she is young. This is because sin corrupts us all in different ways. The feminine human nature that God designed was a submissive one which desired to be dominated by the masculine human nature. But sin corrupted both the masculine and feminine human natures that God designed, and sin corrupts these natures in many different ways. Sin can sometimes corrupt the feminine nature, making it more dominant than submissive, while at the same time it can corrupt the masculine nature, making it more passive or submissive rather than dominant as God designed it to be. All women have their God-given submissive natures corrupted to one degree or another, but some have their natures so corrupted that there is little to nothing left of the sweet and submissive nature God meant for women to have. So, if you find after years of attempting to groom your wife that you are running into a brick wall with her, should you just give up on trying to incorporate biblical gender roles into your marriage? The answer is no. You as the man are responsible before God to do everything you can do on your end. If your wife will not submit to spankings as a form of discipline, then you move to non-physical forms of discipline, like removing the debit card and credit cards while still providing for all her basic needs. Shouldn't you do that before you move to physical discipline? But okay. You call her out when she disrespects you, even if she does not receive this. You limit her access to your free time. You lead her, even if your wife will not follow. But one thing you never do is surrender to her desire to control your marriage. And do not fall for the lie of partnership marriage. No marriage is ever a true partnership. Marriage is always a patriarchy or a matriarchy. It might be a soft patriarchy or soft matriarchy where no one explicitly acknowledges being in charge, and the one in charge might actually allow great freedom to the other. But make no mistake, someone is always in charge in a marriage. Power vacuums are never left unfilled. This seems like a very strange way to talk about marriage to me, but I've never been married, so anyone who is or has been married, do you find that there is a power struggle in your marriage? I'm very curious about that. All right, so you've learned how to groom your young bride. Now, how will you discipline her? After all, you're both full of sin, and it's your job as husband to correct her. How to discipline your wife. When we hear the word discipline in the context of wives, this can be a scary term for many. It invokes images of husbands beating their wives and knocking them around or locking them in closets. It might invoke images of husbands standing over their wives, yelling and screaming at them, and using all kinds of obscenities. This is not the type of discipline that we are talking about in a biblical context. Men who behave in such ways will answer to God for this abusive treatment of their wives. So he goes through some arguments against disciplining your wife, and his response is, a partnership cannot discipline their other partner, but the Bible does not show marriage as a partnership, but rather a patriarchy, male-led hierarchy. Discipline infantilizes a wife, but discipline is something that applies to adults as well as children. Governments have the power to discipline their adult citizens, military commands have the ability to discipline adults under their command, blah, 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 blah. A wife's submission to her husband is voluntary, therefore he cannot discipline her. But I have shown how the scriptures refute the idea that a wife's submission is voluntary, but rather they show that her submission is mandatory and synonymous with obedience. Christ does not discipline his bride, but those who say God does not discipline his bride are ignoring passages of scripture that show both in his previous marriage to Israel as well as his current betrothal to the church that he in fact does discipline his bride. Wait, his previous marriage to Israel as well as his current betrothal. So Jesus is a bigamist? What? Okay. This probably makes more sense to current Christians than to people like me who haven't been in a church in a while. He goes on to state he doesn't condone all methods prescribed by Christian domestic discipline, but he doesn't think wife spanking is sinful. We then get how discipline is beneficial, it makes us a better person, it should be measured, it's about holiness, and it maintains order. And now, here are 7 tips for disciplining your wife. Discipline towards your wife should always start with a gentlest approach first and only move towards harder forms of discipline if the gentle approach does not yield results. Warnings should always be given before harder types of discipline are implemented. You should always pray and seek the Lord's guidance before using these types of discipline. Number 1, for disrespect. If your wife is speaking in disrespectful and demeaning ways in public in front of others, whether this is toward you or others, this might require a public rebuke of her tone and actions. Number 2, for overspending. If your wife is spending money against your wishes, this may require confiscation of her credit cards and ATM cards. Of course, this can be done in measured amounts. Perhaps you might just take away 1 or 2 cards that she has abused, and if her spending continues to get out of control, you would move toward removing the ATM card as well. This does not necessarily mean she would have no money, but you could give her a cash allowance each week. Number 3, for failing to care for your children or contradicting your authority with your children. Your children. Not our children, your children. If your wife is failing to do her duties as a mother towards your children, or she has continued to contradict your authority with the children, then perhaps you might put off buying that new car for her and have her continue driving her older car for a while as long as it is safe for her to drive. If you have to purchase another car, you could downgrade the type of car she will be able to get or buy her a used one instead. Maybe you put off the purchase of that new dishwasher she has been wanting. Number 4, for too much TV watching. If your wife is watching too much TV, you could cancel the cable or satellite TV and just have antenna service. Number 5, for too much online time. If your wife is spending too much time online, like Facebook or other social outlets or online shopping, then if she does not respond to your warnings about this, you could change your internet code on your router so that her devices will not have access to the internet. Number 6, for neglect of home. Maybe your wife is not watching too much TV or spending too much time online, but she is still neglectful toward her duties in your home. If your wife is being neglectful of her duties to care for your home, then you might put off that new living room furniture set you have been talking about, or those new window dressings she has been wanting. Number 7, for sexual denial. If your wife is unsubmissive in the sexual arena and chronically denies your sexual advances without legitimate medical or psychological reasons for doing so, who decides if they're legitimate? Then perhaps the upcoming trip you were going to take her on gets canceled. Maybe that wardrobe upgrade your wife was looking forward to gets downsized or canceled. The Bible says a man has to supply his wife with clothing, but it does not say it has to be the expensive clothing she wants. It's really interesting to me that, there's 7, and 5 or 6 out of these 7 all have financial disciplinary actions. I don't know. I don't know. It doesn't seem very Christian to me, but this whole thing doesn't seem very Christian to me, so this post was extremely popular, and apparently there were a few common questions. What if your wife works and thus has her own money? Well, wives must choose to submit to discipline. There is no question. I am not saying it is optional or voluntary. God requires women to submit to the discipline of their husbands, but a husband cannot physically control his wife or her actions. However, just because a husband cannot physically control his wife, he is still required to do as much as in his power to do as her husband to bring discipline into her life that will show her the right path. Now, she can either rebel against the discipline and try and go around it, or she can learn the lesson that is meant to be learned by the discipline. When a husband has done everything he can do as his wife's immediate authority, then he leaves her in the hands of her higher authority, which is God himself. But won't this just lead to divorce? Well, divorce is a real possibility regardless of whether or not you discipline your wife. I'm pretty sure this sort of behavior would up the chance of divorce, but okay. But as a husband, you must stand against sin in your home. Your wife will then be left with the choice of whether she will rebel against your discipline and therefore against God's authority, or she will submit to your discipline and learn from it, and the fruit of it will be righteousness in her life. Can't you just talk to your wife? Well, of course you should speak gently with your wife first. But are we so naive to think that every wife will respond to these gentle conversations and turn from her sinful behavior, whatever that may be? Is there no such thing as an unrepentant and rebellious, sinful wife who tells her husband where he can stick it anytime he brings things to her attention? What if finances are tight? Well, in that case, you discipline your wife with time. You see, most women want 3 things from their husband: money, time, and tokens of affection. I feel like tokens of affection are another way of saying money, but okay. Of course, you shouldn't outright ignore her, but use your time wisely. If you give your wife 5 hours of your free time a week for just the 2 of you, cut it back to 3 hours. Perhaps there are some TV shows you watch with your wife that you have zero interest in, but you just watch them to spend some time with her. Stop doing this. There may be upgrades around the house that require more of your time than your money. Perhaps it's repainting rooms. Leave handyman tasks alone until they are absolutely necessary. I think my favorite part might be, even a husband is not immune to discipline, but rather, his discipline comes from the church or from civil authorities. For instance, if a wife is being physically abused by her husband, she has every biblical right to go to her husband's authorities in the church and in civil government to seek help and for them to discipline him. I like how his example is physical abuse, not emotional, financial, not anything he mentioned that a wife could be disciplined for, but physical abuse. So now that we've discussed grooming and disciplining your young wife, I would like to talk about Maranatha Chapman. And for anyone who wants to read the full story, I will link that in the description box. Having been saved at age 19, Matthew Chapman felt led to the ministry. He attended Baylor University's ministerial program and began serving as a ministerial intern at a large church in Waco, Texas. During this time, he began to look for mentorship from an older man at the church, a homeschooling father named Stan Owen. Stan became Matthew's spiritual father, and the two spent a great deal of time together. In the summer of 1986, Stan began to feel that God had destined Matthew to marry his daughter Maranatha. Without talking to either Matthew, his spiritual son, or Maranatha, his biological daughter, Stan dedicated the two together in marriage in prayer before God. In early fall of 1986, Matthew confessed to Stan that he was troubled by a strong attraction to Stan's daughter Maranatha, confessing that he found her very attractive and that she had become a distraction. "I don't know what to do about it," he said. According to Lindvall's telling, Matthew was certain this attraction could not be right, since Maranatha was so much younger than he. "Have you ever considered that this may be a good thing?" Stan asked him in response. "How do you know this isn't from the Lord?" But Stan went on to tell Matthew that Maranatha wasn't ready for marriage yet, and that he therefore needed to put a hold on his feelings for a while. Matthew continued to be a frequent guest in Stan's home, constantly in contact with Maranatha and the rest of the family, but was forbidden to tell Maranatha about his feelings or have any physical contact with her. Shortly after this, Maranatha told her father that she had an interest in Matthew. As time went by, Maranatha found her attraction to Matthew increasingly distracting. She told her father about her crush as she had been taught to do. Stan told Maranatha that she needed to keep her heart pure and focused on the Lord and to wholly give herself to the Lord without any lingering desire for Matthew. And Maranatha obediently sought to do just that. Of course, Stan had already decided to give Maranatha to Matthew, so this was simply a matter of biding his time until he decided Maranatha was ready. A year later, in early fall of 1987, Matthew felt that God had told him by direct communication that he, Matthew, was to marry Maranatha. Matthew shared with his mentor what God had told him and asked permission to propose to Maranatha. Stan confirmed that the thoughts may well have been from God, but asked Matthew to wait a little longer, promising to share when he had heard from God himself. Several months went by and Christmas arrived. Stan's Christmas present to Matthew was a Christmas card with the words, "This year for Christmas, I'm going to give you the greatest gift I could ever give you," on the front. Inside was a photograph of Maranatha. There were also instructions. On January 1st, you may ask Maranatha to marry you. The instructions stated, however, that while Matthew and Maranatha could become engaged, Stan would not give Maranatha to Matthew until he determined she was ready, which might be months or years. Matthew proposed and Maranatha accepted. Stan wanted to do things as they were done in the Bible when betrothal was legally binding. Therefore, on February 22, 1988, just over a month after Matthew's proposal and Maranatha's acceptance, the two were legally married at the courthouse. Maranatha continued to live in her father's home until her official wedding day, which, although she was already legally married, would be when she would begin her married life. The summer of 1988, Stan decided that Maranatha was ready. In the 6 or so months since Matthew's proposal and Maranatha's acceptance, Matthew had prepared a home for them to live in, and Maranatha had sewed a wedding dress. After dinner one day, Stan unexpectedly and without prior warning informed Matthew and Maranatha that the time was fast approaching. But Stan wanted to reenact the biblical story of Jesus as bridegroom and the church as his bride, so he did not give either Matthew or Maranatha a date. Immediately after Stan's surprise announcement, Maranatha was taken by her family members to the home of another Christian family. There, Maranatha waited for Matthew to come and claim her. Every day between 3 p.m. and midnight, she dressed in her wedding dress and sat with her suitcase, waiting. Finally, at long last, Stan told Matthew that the day had arrived, and Matthew came to the house where Maranatha was staying, claimed her, and took her to a surprise wedding feast Stan had prepared, complete with guests, singing, and dancing. The couple then left on their honeymoon and began their married life. So now, let's talk ages. When Matthew first expressed his interest in Maranatha, interest Stan affirmed as from God, but asked Matthew to put on hold, Maranatha was 13 and Matthew was 26. When Matthew heard from God that he was to marry Maranatha and begged Stan to let him propose marriage to her, Maranatha was 14 and Matthew was 27. When Stan gave Matthew the go-ahead to propose to his daughter, Maranatha was 15 and Matthew was 27. They were the same ages when they married just over a month later, and when Maranatha left her father's home and the couple began their married life together, Maranatha was 15 and Matthew was 28. In 2008, 1 week after turning 16, Maranatha and Matthew's daughter, Lauren, was married to a 26-year-old man. The picture in the thumbnail is from their wedding. So basically, the man is king. Yes, Larry pays lip service to men needing to submit to God and government, but he can simply say, God laid it on my heart to justify his behavior. Jesus isn't going to be descending from heaven to rebuke him. And as for government, if you get that young wife and mold her to your desires, is she really going to report her husband for abuse? Especially if she has a female mentor like, say, Lori Alexander. Would she even recognize abuse for what it is, or would she just consider it a form of discipline that she needs because she's a sinner? This man is basically writing a how-to guide for abusive relationships and shielding it with the Bible. So I wanted to include the Maranatha story to show how far these beliefs can go, and what their purpose is. Most families at least wait until their daughter is 18, but the US is shockingly friendly to child marriage, which is so interesting given how conservatives keep talking about how the left is just full of groomers. It's done, so all we can hope is that Maranatha and Lauren are safe and happy, but I hope that Lauren doesn't repeat that cycle with her own daughter. Although, let's be honest, Lauren will not have any say in that decision. And yes, Texas still allows marriage at 16 with parental consent. And that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, night, whenever you're watching this, and I will see you next week. Bye! Are you going to pounce or what? Thank you.